Hiya and welcome to this week's episode of Inside Property Development, where I'm delighted to be speaking with David Birbeck, basically one of the most knowledgeable people I know in the whole world of planning, design and development, even though he's not a planner or a developer, but he's got massive knowledge and experience, so much so that I can't even remember it all, so I'm going to have to read it for a change. So he's Chief Executive at Design for Homes. He's a Housing Design Awards Director, has been since 2005. He's an Honorary Fellow of the RIBA. He's a HCA Design Board member. He's an NHBC councillor, or at least he was, previous Housing Forum Board member. So basically a man that really is passionate about housing and knows it inside out. And I love speaking with him, and hopefully you'll love listening to it. Thanks for coming, David.
Good to see you.
In case someone doesn't know who you are, do you want to give us a little quick intro?
Yeah, lots of people won't know who I am because I actually am relatively quiet in the background behind a social enterprise that does a lot of stuff. So Design for Homes has been around for a long time, and we set up a series of ideas for how to get better housing. The government has adopted some of those. We never made them into regulations. Every time you turn anything into regulation, it gets chucked on a bonfire of regulations every time there's a downturn in the economy. So we've always tried to produce stuff that essentially helps people with ideas how to get more and better housing. And we work on the Housing Design Awards. That's the biggest database of ideas for what you can do in new development in the world. There are about 100 films on there for people who want to see what people actually have built and what they think about it. And we also worked on something called Building for a Healthy Life, which is a planning tool in the NPPF, where it's recommended by the government as something that local authorities can use in order to get more and better housing.
Now, I've got to say, for someone that's not a developer or a planner or an architect, you really do know your stuff inside out.
I'm blessed with a good memory. I'm lucky. And I think if I can, read 4 hours of stuff a day, I'll remember all of it. So just fortunate.
Very good. Okay. So, well, look, I think you are brilliantly positioned to tell us how we might get good quality housing created.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for the opportunity. There are lots and lots of interest groups in the property industry, and they're all very good. Most of them exist because they're very good at pitching ideas to government. And in the first instance, in that first kind of look at me, I've got all the ideas kind of excitement that comes with the new government, I tend to step back because these people are so skilled and so professional. It's just not worth competing. So I'm grateful for the chance to kind of sort of be in a second sort of wave of ideas with you on your podcast, because I think it's time now to discuss some of this. The big challenge for any government that's trying to grow housing is at some point, somebody somewhere will start a sort of anti-development lobby. It will become successful. It could be it's attached in particular to one of the political parties. I've got a feeling that it might even be two, and I think I know which ones they'll be. However, when that starts, it's only going to become effective from about 2028 onwards. We've got to have an election by July of 29, and I think early 28 you'll start to see a lot more campaigning around why do we need to have all these homes. But one of the real kind of elephant traps that's opening up for the government is the prospect of essentially developing at a density that would require a huge amount of new land release. Most local authorities really struggle to get their local plans adopted. It's probably the hardest thing most of the members have to do every year. And the idea that you would suddenly say to them, right, all go back to square one and increase the land release that you need in your local plan by about a third, which is where we're currently headed if they don't change direction. Most of those local authorities just won't manage it. And then you'll have like the local firefights, you'll have all the NIMBY movements and all the kind of key electoral battlegrounds. Then you have the specialist advisors working in places like Downing Street, warning the government, we might need to go soft now on some of this stuff because we're looking at losing a third of our MPs if we don't. And then we're in big trouble again. We're straight back to square one. Everyone will start building at levels way below what they should be building at.
At its simplest, for people that don't get it, we need more housing. It's either going to go up or it's going to go out. But dependent on, and grey belt is a big new thing. And if it is going to go out, because we've been trying to keep it on brownfield first for years and years and years, and that still is the main focus, but that stuff is harder, slower, very less viable, which is why Greenbelt is getting released. But if it's not done in the right way, particularly with the right type of housing, like I say, it will just sprawl and it will piss people off and there will be pushback. So there's got to, that stuff does need to be developed, but it's about how and with what type of housing, isn't it?
I agree. I think that this kind of binary choice people make between it's got to go out or it's got to go up is a mistake. I don't think that is correct. And we're very lucky that we've already got one quite big example of this. Cambridge has become, by accident, possibly because it's been a very successful housing market, has become by accident essentially a laboratory for new ideas. Now, they committed back in their local plan some time ago to building about 73,000 new homes in the greater sort of Cambridge area, everywhere from Peterborough to Cambridge to Waterbeach and then sort of south to places like Camborne. And they set off doing that. They did that by taking on old US airfield bases along the A14, but in particular by growing the size of the city. They took 300 acres out of the Greenbelt. They were the first local authority to essentially redraw their Greenbelt. Everyone's talking about it now. And they said, well, look, if we're going to build new homes, it's idiotic to put them somewhere where there's no opportunity for people to find jobs and no one can get to work unless they drive. So we'll replan where the city sits and where all the jobs are, and we'll make sure that they're all side by side. And they did it, and they've done it very successfully, to the point that the most successful of all the developments, called Great Knighton, has grown so fast, it literally broke every record in the UK for the number of new homes built every year. Now, it didn't go up. It just got a lot more compact. And people think that means what you're essentially doing is building houses in people's gardens. Well, they are in many ways. I mean, that is part of the rethinking of the planning process there. But the homes themselves also grew internally in size. So if you look at the average range of, say, a volume house builder, the majority of the houses will be between about 800 and, say, 1,400 square feet. You'll have a 3-bedroom starter home at maybe 825, and then you'll have your big 5-bedroom, potentially over even 3 stories, somewhere around about 1,400 square feet. If you look at what gets built at Great Knighton, the smaller homes are bigger than some of the medium-range homes, and the big homes are really big. There are homes at Great Knighton that are over 3,000 square feet. There are flats at Great Knighton that are over 1,400 square feet. 2-bedroom flats at more than 1,400 square feet. That is bigger than most house builders' 5-bedroom houses. So they haven't gone small. They haven't said, right, we can build loads of rabbit hutches, as people like to call some of these products. They didn't do that. They also made them far more energy efficient, and they also made them look much better as places. They built proper communities. And they've done it all within the envelope of, say, maximum 5 stories, mostly.
Oh, that was going to be my question, really, is what's the sort of typical heights?
Typical heights would be 3 stories.
Okay.
And then every now and again, a building that steps up to sort of say, hey, look, you're arriving in a new place. And that might be 5. But that will be a tiny percentage of the total. And at Great Knighton, what's really surprising, and really quite hard to get your head around, is that there are 2,300 homes there, and 80% of them have their own front door. In other words, there aren't loads and loads of blocks of flats with double bank corridors where people kind of stumble over other people's pizza boxes outside their flats. You're talking about people able to push their pushchair straight off the street into their own home through their own front door. And that's what most people aspire to first and foremost.
What are typical densities?
Well, this is the big difference. Historically, everything's always been worked on the basis of, say, the number of homes per acre. And the majority of this country builds at 12 or 13 to the acre. Now, when you go to look at Great Knighton, it's all coming in at a minimum of about 25, 26 to the acre. So they've literally doubled the number of units to a typical 1-acre parcel. The big change, though, is not just that they've doubled the numbers, but that all these units have got their own front door, and they're all typically bigger and better performing than the houses that will be built, say, 10 miles west of Cambridge. So this is the big surprise. Numbers alone, they don't do anything. Invariably, they lead to things like housing market collapse at some point in the future when suddenly people turn against a place because it's been poorly planned and oversold. Well, at Cambridge, they're just not doing that. They are actually building much better homes, and they're building them at higher coverage rates. So there is more square footage to be bought or rented per acre. And generally, the individual units have more internal square footage as well.
Interesting. Well, before you tell me the answer to this question, some fairly detailed design guidance.
There is, and Cambridge is one of the few places that didn't cut back on its local authority staff in the planning departments.
Interesting.
So I think what they realised was they were going to go through very large housing growth, that they would be ridiculous to get rid of the people that were needed to deliver it. And there are plenty of people there who know their stuff. I mean, some of the Cambridge planners are amongst the best in the UK. One in particular who set all these ideas up was arguably one of the greatest local authority planners of the last 50 years, Peter Studdart. And he set up a whole series of procedures, including having sort of review panels to advise the officers on any potential pratfalls that they needed to look again twice at, particular ways that those panels work. So they never got to talk about things like the architecture. They always had to talk about the community, the character, the connectivity, and the climate benefit of each scheme. And so you didn't get that kind of crazy idea where you had architects arguing with architects about what was the better style of architecture or the better typology. Instead, you had a group of people that included people from various different disciplines saying things like, I personally think this scheme won't work without a play area in that particular location, because if you look at all the dwellings next to it, those are the ones that are going to have all the kids. So why would you put the play area further away on the other side of the development? It needs to be there next to the homes with all the kids. And that was the kind of review process that Peter put in place.
Yeah, very good. So look, that approach sounds like absolutely the way forward. Just to jump back to what definitely isn't the way forward, and it's worth talking about, because there will be some local authorities that are still doing things or looking to do things the wrong way. So this, like, one of my pet things that's driven me around the bend for years is the Essex Design Guide. Yeah. So I can't remember, like 1973, 1976, whenever it was,
73.
Was it 73?
Yeah.
Was it designed for, typical big volume housing estates in the wilds of Essex, all of the stuff that people have come to not like, identikit housing, it gets called, and stuff like that. And, and there were a whole load of standards in there, 21 metre back-to-back distances being the classic, that then got adopted by nearly every local authority all over the country, including places in London. And it was absolutely planning by numbers. So, the stories I can tell you about, things where the habitable room was 20.9 metres, not 21, and it's an instant refusal. It was just absolute crazy bonkers. And unbelievably, there are still local authorities like that are trying to apply those sort of rules, and it's just crazy. So by the sounds of things, obviously, Cambridge, and it doesn't have to be that way. You can get really good, well designed, good quality housing and communities, by just doing things in a much more sensible way. And it sounds like that's what Cambridge have done.
Yeah, the planning rule that you talked there specifically about, the 70-foot, 23-metre distance rule, is an odd one. It comes from the Tudor Walters report, 1919, Homes Fit for Heroes report. And, really strange origins. Essentially, you had people standing outside in a field with their shirts off and measuring the distance at which a person could see another person's nipple on their chest.
Yeah.
And they discovered it was 70 foot. So we introduced a rule, a modesty rule. It was thought at 70 foot, if you saw your neighbour dressing, you were unlikely to get excited because you couldn't see enough details to get excited about. Absolutely mad that literally 110 years later,
crazy, isn't it?
That we're still working to a rule which is all about Edwardian sensibilities about what's right and proper. We have finally abandoned that in most places. And its worst example, just as you said, in London, London Borough of Southwark, it's got obviously the river edge, the bit everybody knows around, say, things like Blackfriars Bridge, where you've got some of the tallest buildings in Europe. But it does go all the way through to places like Streatham, where everything is two-storey housing, and a lot of it built to Tudor Walter's rules.
Yeah.
So you had a strange-shaped planning authority in the city centre, the piece of land that really stretches from the river all the way down into sort of outer London, roughly the shape of your finger, actually, if you could imagine on a north-south axis. And it covers virtually every type of residential development, from 80 stories to 1 story. And it was insane to employ those rules rigidly across every single planning application. Now, fortunately, all the London authorities have abandoned it. Most of the local authorities in England have abandoned it. Ireland, which of course was left with it after 1923, they've only just got rid of it. They got rid of it January last year. And you're now in a situation where everyone is beginning to evaluate things on what quality of space you get rather than minimum distances between buildings. And that, again, is something that Cambridge has completely pioneered. So in the UK, the expression back-to-backs, or in particular, the type of industrial back-to-back housing that you found in places like Birmingham and Leeds, I mean, it comes with this concept. Essentially, you were living in a dwelling that probably only had a single window, and you were probably sharing it with 4 or 5 other people. The sanitation was appalling. In many cases, it was literally open sewers to the backs of the properties, and people were dying all the time of things like TB. And so we introduced all these regs to deal with that kind of nastiness that we had as an industrial power at the end of the 19th century. And of course, we just got away from all that. Our sanitation systems now are generally very good. And the concept you would have to build houses with a certain distance between them to stop people from getting TB is insane when virtually nobody gets TB anymore. But we've adopted those plan policies and kept them on the books for so long. In many cases, they seem almost impossible to get rid of. It's been a big pushback. Cambridge probably, again, led on all of this. And fortunately, the end result is now proven. 10 years of building houses essentially without any gaps between the house that might be facing west and the house that might be facing east, literally. So they butt up to each other, and they don't have any windows in their back walls because they are literally built against each other, with the backs becoming a party wall. Instead of it being to the side, like everyone's familiar with, it's to the back. And then the gardens go up on the roofs, so that you end up with 2 houses facing in opposite directions, and the private spaces go up on the top of the property rather than in the gardens of the property. They've been doing that for 10, 11, 12 years now. Very, very, very popular developments. In particular, really popular with people who are very anxious about being seen in their gardens. If you come into an environment from, say, work, where you've had to wear something to hide parts of your body because that is your religion, and you go home, the one thing you don't want is to go into your private space and be overlooked by your neighbours, because then you have to keep those same clothes on in order to protect the modesty that your religion says you have to. But if you have a rooftop garden, unless someone goes over the top of you in a helicopter, no one sees what you're doing up on the rooftop. So it gives those people a chance to throw off the clothing that allows them to get a bit of sun on their bodies, and they're very much happier in those homes.
Have you much knowledge or experience of how that type of approach is being accepted and applied or not to other local authorities?
Well, the interesting element about it is it's actually being copied faster by planning authorities outside of England than planning authorities inside England. So when we've had a period where we've had a government that was married to a particular concept, which was essentially everything should look like the middle of the 19th century, a lot of the very innovative stuff was pushed to one side, while the people that were leading that thinking promoted their particular world vision. Now that government's gone. You've finally got an opportunity to talk about other things other than why the middle of the 19th century architecture was better than today's architecture, which was essentially the argument for the last 5 or 10 years. Now we're actually looking at how buildings work again and what works for people, and why some unusual dwelling forms are actually more successful than some more commonplace dwelling forms. And that opportunity to essentially adopt these as ideas was stifled by the kind of sort of consensus view within government circles that they needed to keep pushing the idea of building beautiful, building to a particular style, and that's all that mattered. And the reality is that meanwhile, things were going on in places like Cambridge that other people were spotting and going, that's a great idea. We're talking about it happening in Liverpool, we're talking about it happening in Sheffield. But Ireland was the place that really spotted it. Ireland has a very significant housing problem, one which is actually so dangerous to them as a political electoral system that they got extraordinarily close to the two leading parties being voted out and overtaken by Sinn Féin, which stood on a ticket that said everybody can have their own home with their own front door. So the existing political parties, the established or more established political parties, then ran on a ticket of what they call own door housing, came up with planning policy that would deliver own door housing so everybody could be guaranteed to get access to a home which had its own front door, big sort of political concept. And they produced planning rules that essentially are the copy of what they were doing in Cambridge. Mm. When you look at the document released last year, the first thing you spot is that nearly every photograph is from Cambridge.
Is that right? So interesting. I know nothing about housing in Ireland.
Well, it's essentially the same as the housing in the UK. The biggest problem, I think, with housing in Ireland is the fact that they had a bigger housing crash than we had, and their banks are still insisting that people only borrow 75% of the value. And so that's meant there are lots and lots of viability issues because, as we know in this country, until you can borrow about 90% of the value, that's beyond most households. Imagine if it was 75%.
Super interesting. Right now, of course, is, we've got a new NPPF a couple of months ago. We now have a thing called grey belt, but which wasn't really officially a thing until then. Lots of green belt will get developed for a few years until hopefully someone doesn't shut the door again in when a new government comes in. There's a big opportunity to do the Cambridge type of stuff. And obviously what's going to happen is, let's just say at its simplest, if you're building at 2 stories, you're going to use twice as much land as if you were building at 4 stories.
If you have gardens front and back.
Yeah.
And this is the big sort of radical element that's beginning to happen. Even developments by Barratt around Cambridge, they don't have your traditional apron of space to the front where everyone parks and then your big deep garden to the back. They don't do that. The house types have less gardens to the back, but more outdoor space, more amenity space by introducing more private space coming off, say, the bedroom at first floor. So people, instead of having the typically unworkable balcony that's just about big enough to, say, put something like your bicycle on it, these places have terraces where essentially you might step out of your bedroom onto something that might be 4 meters deep by 8 meters wide. And your 32 meters of terrace is enough for you and your entire family or something to have Sunday lunch on. And that is a very different prospect as amenity space than, say, the type of thing that we would normally have built, say, 10, 15 years ago.
I know you know housing and design inside out, so you'll definitely know this. You know the Berkeley Urban House?
Yeah, I know the man who designed it. He's an extraordinary character.
Yeah,
Peter Nesbitt.
Yeah.
And his design takes the space out at the back of the property and puts it on the roof. And they discovered very, very quickly that it absolutely suited some people down to the ground. Now, they've never built more than about 1,000 of those. But I mean, all the 1,000 households that bought those, bought them because they all sell for about £1 million in places like Greenwich.
Yeah,
everybody really likes the idea.
It'll be an interesting one, and I'll show you it, and I'll talk to you about it at the time. Where I am currently planning at the moment. 1, using that type of concept, and 2, just as an example, plotting standard 2-story housing. So I can actually talk to local authority. It's a green belt site, but absolutely ticks a grey belt box in terms of it's contained on 3 sides, so it won't be contributing to urban sprawl in any way. But I nevertheless am expecting some pushback. But I want to exactly show them and say, look, you could have this or you could have this. This is X homes, that's Y homes. What do you think? So it'll be interesting.
I think this business of horse trading on numbers, I think is really important. I think there is a sort of sense in a lot of local planning authorities that they either get 12 houses or they get a block of flats. And suddenly in those grey-green sort of mixed up areas, where people are saying, well, you do have a greater opportunity to build out because of the grey belt policy. But what people don't necessarily sort of, I think at the moment, grasp is that I think there'll still be all the sensitivity about how it impacts on the open countryside. So if you tried to put up an 8-story apartment building that you could see from every single part of that particular bit of the greenbelt, then it's quite likely, I think, the planning inspector would pick up on the impact on the greenbelt and what they call the open countryside policy. They'll say, well, hang on a minute, you can't just put a great big slab of concrete or brick in the middle of what is a very beautiful set of views. But if people can keep it compact and they can build at a much greater coverage rate at, say, 2 and 3 story, and have quite a lot of development to sell, and in particular lots of homes that have their own front door, because I think one of the emerging grey belt policies is that it has to have quite a high percentage of affordable housing.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of affordable housing operators have got a huge demand for homes that would be suitable for families. And, families don't want the 7th floor of an apartment building. They don't want to drag their kids in the lift, drag all their down the corridor and then into a flat. They want their front door where they can leave the tricycles, they can leave the prams, they can do all the things that families do when they're growing.
Yep.
And they want those kind of properties. Now, we've seen pioneering examples of this. There are copies around Dublin, which are copies of the things that have been built in Cambridge. There are copies around Dublin that are copies of the things that have been built in Liverpool. There are schemes in Sheffield that are essentially inspired by the schemes that have been built in Cambridge. And they are beginning to pop up everywhere. And I think it's the answer. I just can't see how flats are going to, deal with all these sensitivities people have about not having big bruising buildings next to them and not having them in what they consider to be their precious countryside. But most people will accept a 3-story building. There's very little to get upset about with a 3-story building. And the concept that you would have, being built at grade, access for cars somehow incorporated into the footprint of the dwelling, as opposed to needing to go down into the earth and build concrete underground car parks or big slabs of car parking space, again in the greenbelt.
Yeah.
Not a good idea, is it?
No.
So, the concept that you would have your garages inside the footprint of your building, like, again, they do a lot at Cambridge. I just think it's the solution politically, but also economically. If you're going to build 12 homes and it's going to give you, say, 16,000 square feet to sell, and you're trying to buy a bit of the greenbelt around London, I don't really see how you can make that work. But potentially, if you were going to be selling, say, 25 homes and it gave you 2.5 times the amount of coverage to sell, then potentially you'd have something to play with, I think, in the land tender. Otherwise, everyone's going to outbid each other for something they in the end can't afford to build.
I'm guessing there's probably a few architects in particular that are really good at this stuff. I don't know.
There are. I think just generally there are a group of architects that have been working on essentially remodeling very similar ideas over a period of about 20 to 25 years. And over that time, they've sort of learned what works and what doesn't work. And I think that is a process that a lot of architects have to go through because, you almost need to build something and then go back and talk to people that live in it and discover that after 3 years, the people are happy or they're not happy and find out what it was. And then you learn during the process of building it, which is the expensive bit you hadn't realized was going to be quite so expensive that almost sinks you at the time. So you don't do it the second time or the third time. And one of the great benefits of having volume builders is that they do learn these things. They know better than anybody that if you do a particular thing, it's going to cost an extra 10% on the construction cost. And potentially, I think a lot of architects don't. So the ones that have been around the block a few times have got a lot to contribute here.
Numbers are sort of important. Obviously, the government are talking about 1.5 million new homes and all the rest of it. Obviously, you can get a lot more on less land at those sorts of densities.
Yeah, I think it's really important the first thing to start off with, the first year of this government, we're probably going to end up building less than 200,000 homes. In fact, we'd be quite lucky to get to 200,000. And you're looking at, say, a total figure there for England, Wales and Scotland, because there's always confusion around this. So when the government talks about it's 1.5 million homes, it's talking about 300,000 a year in England, because the English government isn't responsible for house building in either Scotland or Wales. So it's saying, well, let's build 300,000. Well, the total number in England this year will be something like 140. So it's begun 160,000 down, or more than half down on its target straight off. And it's got to somehow correct that over the next couple of years. So I think the thing it will do is throw lots of money at some of the big schemes that have already got outline planning approval, redraw some of what would be called reserve matters applications so that you get far more bigger numbers in, and put money behind it. So all those issues like infrastructure that would cost a lot of money and so on, they will fund that in order to allow the actual landowner to accelerate the build-out program. Now, you can see this happening. Barking Riverside had an extant planning approval for 12,800. It's currently going through a process of having about 6 or 7 parcels at Barking Riverside redrawn for about 2 to 3 times the original numbers. So the total number now expected from Barking Riverside will be closer to 25,000. In other words, 100% uplift. And most of those parcels would be likely to get planning approval because the concept of Barking Riverside is well established. The quantity of homes are already sort of well understood. The fact that you might find twice as many doesn't really impact on too much because it's already got its own railway station, it's already got its own schools, it's already got its own Uber boat that will take you into central London on its own pier. So why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you bump up the numbers? But the other places they'll go for will be places like Ebbsfleet and Cambridge. And in fact, they announced very speculatively, and I think it was just an attempt to get a really good Sunday newspaper headline, that they were going to add 250,000 homes to Cambridge summer of last year. That's before the July 24 election. I'm talking summer of 23. And that caused, a lot of grief locally in the Cambridge area because they thought they were doing really well. They were already building far faster than anywhere else was in the UK. And they didn't understand why a high-profile politician would go on the record to say, we're now going to increase the numbers in Cambridge by a factor of 4. And a lot of people just sort of thought this is just grandstanding. And just to look at Cambridge, why would you do it to Cambridge? It's a relatively small city. It's got a population of less than 150,000 people. It's part of an area called the Greater Cambridge Area, and that's got a population of 310,000. And if you look at the numbers it builds in the Greater Cambridge Area, it's 5,000 units a year. Well, first of all, that's 20 times what a similar city called Oxford builds, 20 times, not twice, 20. And then it's about 5 times more than the average per capita across the whole of England. So across England, the number of new homes per capita of the population is a fraction. In Cambridge, I think currently it's something like 1 new home for something like every 85 people in Cambridge. The rest of England, it's like 1 new home for every 500,000. Not 500,000, sorry, every 5,000. So you're looking at a significant speed change in the Cambridge area. They're producing homes like Germany or France does. No.
So couple of questions around that. So who owns or owned the land?
Variety of responses on that. One of the reasons why you've got a lot of ambition in the Cambridge area is because the university owns some of the land.
Yeah.
And the university has this desire to see investment in the university's housing stock so that it can attract the best postgraduate students. Because in the end, the university, like it's done for the last 900 years, wants to be first with all the big breakthroughs. Don't forget the university was where Newton came up with the idea of gravity, where Hawking came up with all his theories, and it's the place where most of the computing and biomedical breakthroughs in the UK have come in the last sort of 30, 40, 50 years. So it's got this proud tradition of attracting the top students and then getting the biggest technological breakthroughs, whether that's discovering DNA in the 50s or, learning how to, make computers talk to computers like they did in the 80s and 90s. So it just seems to stay ahead of everybody else in the competition by investing and attracting the best students. Now, it wanted the best new housing. It wanted to be able to say to people, come here, even if you've got families, even if you're a mature student and you want to find somewhere to raise a family, we can give you the accommodation that make that a nice choice here in Cambridge. And actually, I've been to see a couple of the Cambridge College mature student campus buildings in the last couple of years, several of them are just about the best places I've ever been into. You're thinking about, so am I going to go to MIT in Massachusetts? Am I going to go to Yale in somewhere like, I've forgotten where it is, Yale, but it's in that quite tough town on the edge of Connecticut. It's the kind of place, if you stood in the street for more than about half an hour, you would probably get held up at gunpoint. Well, that's never going to happen to you in Cambridge, and you're going to get better housing. So, it's competing on this stage with Yale, with MIT, for those particular students, and it's building housing which is so much better than you find anywhere else as well. Now, that's driving it. But then the other people that have also bought land and are building at speed are companies like Barratt, are companies like Hill, are companies like Countryside, now part of Vistry. And those companies were buying land to make money for shareholders. And the fact they were able to do it and actually deliver against all the Cambridge planning policies, 40% affordable housing, much stronger energy efficiency standards, much greater focus on cycling. The fact they were able to make good cash while meeting higher targets generally was only made possible because they had to abandon their traditional set of house types and build something that was far greater coverage. So they went from building at, say, 16,000 square feet to the acre to building at 40,000 square feet to the acre, but building houses with parking, houses with their own front door. And they were able to sell those units.
One of the reasons for asking the question about the land ownership situation is to understand any issues around viability. And, as you know, if you've got cheap or free land or someone that really wants you to develop their land, it's easier as opposed to, let's just say, a private landowner that's you've got high existing use value or for whatever reason they just want top dollar. But the other thing, of course, is for private developers to want and be able to build stuff, they've got to be able to sell it. So I know you were telling me the other day that they got really high sales rates, which of course is great because most places stuff is really struggling to sell. So I guess the fact that obviously, Cambridge is just such a good area in terms of employment and education makes a big difference.
I think the big thing was property mix as well. So in a traditional arrangement where you might build, say, quite a lot of houses that would be beyond the point at which an average household might be able to access the market and perhaps no flats, then you were beginning to take the market away from a big chunk of the people who wanted to be homemakers. In Cambridge, they've been a bit more prescriptive about what gets built. So they tend to ask, where are the one-bedroom units? Where are the two-bedroom units? Where are the three-bedroom units? Where are the four-bedroom units? And by doing that and by insisting on a broader property mix, I think that's actually ended up giving some of the developers more different types to sell. Now, you walk into a sales cabin on a Saturday afternoon, they've got something for just about every type of potential homemaker. They'll have something for somebody who's moving from a farmhouse, who's got a grand piano and wants a flat that they can put it in. Well, you can't put that in your average house builder flat. But they've got flats in the Cambridge area which are coming in at between 1,400 and 1,500 square feet. The living space is big enough to convince yourself you're still living in your farmhouse in the Cambridgeshire countryside. So they've got unusual, the type of thing you don't really see very much elsewhere. But the broader mix means that they've got something that means they can throw a much bigger net out and essentially attract and capture a much broader marketplace. That's why they sell so many. I mean, they sell, on an average development, 50 homes a year. It's good, very good business. Would you say that? 50 on an average development?
Amazing.
That would be good, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So what would you say to 250?
More amazing.
Incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
But they've done that, I think, by essentially, milking a very successful local economy, but also by offering a much broader range of products.
Interesting. So, and are you ever any other local authorities that are really doing good stuff like that?
But Bath and North East Somerset is very motivated by the idea, I think, that it's got to be very careful what it builds because obviously it's a World Heritage UNESCO site, which means it cannot have, your standard house type range because that wouldn't fit in. So there's a very, very strong line around what you can and can't build. And of course, that means people have to innovate. And although house builders are brilliant at essentially building the same thing again and again and again, generally they avoid innovation because that's always risky. And, I sympathize with the idea that if you've had something that works for you, why would you go and stick your head in a position where you could get into a lot of trouble because you're taking a huge risk by doing something you've never done before. But when there's no option, you either just don't work there or you innovate. And then I think that a lot of developers will innovate and see if they can get it right. And the clever ones do. Now, Bath, North East Somerset's had a whole load of developers build things I've never seen before. Cambridge and what they call the Greater Cambridge Planning Authority, which is essentially South Cambridgeshire, and the City Council. They likewise, a whole load of products you've never seen before. But you're also seeing them popping up in places like Orgreave, the famous colliery that was all the big battleground for the miners' strike in 1984. There is a development there where they are building things which you wouldn't have found anywhere in England 10 years ago. That is not a high market value area. That is not the kind of place where people can afford to make a mistake, because essentially if you build something there, you're selling it for almost the same price you're building it.
Who's doing that?
There's a couple of developers there, and the scheme that is really interesting is called Sky House, and they're building essentially a high street of dwellings over shops, and it looks like a traditional kind of sort of Victorian pattern. In a sense, you've got a pedestrian high street, flats over shops, and then you've got these things called sky houses, which are essentially back-to-back types. You will find it in places like Crosby. Well, Crosby's in Sefton, that's the northern edge of Liverpool. It's the kind of place where you'd be lucky to get £300 a square foot. Now, normally, that kind of market, no one takes any risks. But in this particular case, I think the local developers decided that was the only way they get the opportunities, would be to come up with something that would give you a bigger development value than building traditionally. So they innovated, they beat the local house builders in the land tender, they got the land opportunities, and then they built these quite radical house types, which have been very, very popular.
Fantastic. Sounds really interesting. I'll have to check those out. Okie dokie. Well, some final little bit, if we were going to round that all up with one little bit of advice or recommendation, a quick summary of how to, what would you say?
I think if local authorities were to set the rules for the more sensitive sites, I think there's always an opportunity to do what we do already. But the problem is you can't do some of these more complicated sites, these more sensitive sites, just by doing what we always do. You've got to build something special or new or innovative. And I think if they were to come up with a set of clear principles for what to do on those sites that didn't involve, say, insisting on a particular form of architecture, was the big mistake of the last government. Thought everything had to look like it was from about 1833. You're automatically backing people into an area where there aren't the skills to even build those homes. And then how much do they cost? What are we talking about? Stone sill dressings and so on. They're going to put the cost of the elevations up by 50% overnight. Yeah. Don't get fussed about stuff like that, but do say we need stuff that gives people what they want, which is lots of different types of homes, because it's a very complicated market now. And we want lots of homes with their own front doors, because that's very, very popular. It's the number one thing that people seek. Nobody wants to live in something that feels like a hotel, where they struggle down 100-meter long corridors just because somebody's got to somehow find some kind of development value to justify the land value they paid. Make them build houses. Make them build houses that are actually much denser, so that you're getting many, many more dwellings off your average site. And for that, you actually need to innovate. So they need to identify what they want on these key sites, and they need to prioritize innovation. And I suppose in the end, that means actually having a decent planning team. One of the problems is that planning authorities have been decimated. Yeah. All the skilled people have been pensioned off. They didn't do that in Cambridge. They didn't do it in Cambridge. They stole all the best people from all the other planning authorities. They teamed up and they recognized the fact they needed to have these staff. And as a result of that, being able to process more planning applications intelligently, as opposed to sort of leaving them in a tray, hoping they'll go away after 8 months.
One final thing, actually, I forgot to ask you about. You were telling me about a little film.
Yes, so there was a report was produced by a research body in the Cambridge area called Cambridge Architectural Research. Essentially, it's a set of people who research the success or not of particular developments. They looked into 6 schemes around Cambridge and they came up with a whole series of very unusual facts, like the fact that Cambridge was building at, literally 10 times the rate of everywhere else. And that it was also more successful in the sense it was selling faster, it was selling at higher values, people were actually making more money, people were getting planning approvals faster because the quality was good enough for the members to vote for. And they were going, well, how do we get more of this? And the government paid for this report in order to try and boil down these sort of 10, 15, 20 examples into a set of maybe ideas that could be codified so that you could say to other local authorities, learn a bit from what Cambridge do, because what they're doing is really intelligent. They're getting all the key ingredients right. So the people that move in are happy, the developers are making more money. Even the committees can defend their positions because they actually approve something that everybody says afterwards, now that's a good place to live. So the report came out last summer. And then I was asked to make a film about some of the key ideas there. So I've been out with a camera team and been filming in the Cambridge area. And obviously one of the things you spot immediately is everybody's on their bicycle. So when you film in a new housing development in Cambridge, you spot the fact that all the kids are going to school on their bicycles. And sometimes 30, 40, 50 in shot at the same time, almost like it's the Tour de France or something, but everyone's wearing a black uniform. No polka dot shirts whatsoever. But the other thing, when you talk to the local politicians, and we got several of them in the film, and they're saying, well, what did we do? Well, the politicians say, well, actually, sometimes you have to play hardball, because if you want all the things that your community is telling you it wants, like new primary schools, new PCTs, the best skateboard park on the planet, you can't get that from the planning gain on a standard development. You cannot get that. You have to create an environment in which the developer is going to make a lot more money to get a lot more planning gain. And that means letting them build more homes, letting them essentially sell bigger homes at higher prices, and to essentially create a bigger net so that they take more sales. And some of these politicians in this film are very clear about this. If they had stuck with standardized development models, they would never have got the cash as a local authority to then get the developers to invest in all the things the community said it wanted. And again, my particular favorite scheme is Great Knighton. And when you go there, you spot the fact it has a new library. I think there is only something like 2 new libraries being built in Britain in like the last 10 years. One of them is on a residential development in Cambridge. It's got a PCT. It's got a community building that other places would die for. It's got a primary school. It's got a secondary school. It's got the best skate park in Britain because that's what the local community said it wanted. And it just goes on and on and on. And there's no way they could have got that without setting a sort of a game plan where everyone was going to win. And the film sort of explains that. And in the end, what it also says, so what do you do here in order to get some of these ideas into your planning authority? And I think the big sort of, the big message is you've got to innovate, you've got to be brave, and you've got to say the standard, proven, tested template is okay. But when you really want something special and you've got a shopping list of things that the local community is saying it wants, then you've got to go to a different game plan. And you need a properly resourced planning department in order to make that happen.
And the film's out, is it? Have you finished it?
The film will be available. You'll be able to find it online. It is called Learning from Cambridge, and it's about 6 minutes long. And, even if you've only got a few minutes to watch, just a few minutes of it, I think one of the really instructive things is to hear the chair of the planning committee saying that homes really aren't what they're about in Cambridge. What they're about is creating the green spaces as well alongside for the mental health benefits. She makes the point very clearly that Cambridge has built about 10 new developments around its fringes and brought more new green space into those 10 developments than you would find as the entire square footage of Hyde Park. Mm-hmm. So you think about Hyde Park, if you entered it from the East End and walked to the West End, it would take you about an hour to walk it. Well, they have added that much green space to a small city within their new developments.
Amazing. Very good. All right. Well, look, I will post the link to that here in the show notes so people can go and have a look at that.
I hope you enjoy it. It was all shot in the depths of winter, which is always a nightmare, especially this year. But I think the thing you can spot is the fact that people on camera, they actually look like they're quite happy. It's not been that kind of a year where people look like they're actually sort of enjoying themselves. But we found a lot of people are clearly quite enjoying, living where they've moved to in the last couple of years. And I thought that was also very positive.
Thanks for coming, David. Thanks for tuning in to Inside Property Development. Please remember to like and subscribe. Do join us every week where we'll be speaking to house builders, developers, experts, planners and everyone involved in trying to get more much needed housing created the right way. We'll learn together how we can collaborate rather than fight, and by working together we can all help create better places, spaces and homes and a much more beautiful world.